So our first question, I'm combining two questions here. One says, I've heard schools are more segregated now than 40 years ago. Our cities are also becoming more segregated. Which came first? New Mexico is different than the rest of the country. Segregation here started February 3rd, 1848, when American troops took over. It was a different kind of process than what you saw in other parts of the United States. And even then, there was a lot of mixing of the populations. It wasn't as segregated as what you see now. What you see now has been not a segregation within the public schools, but basically a class separation here in Santa Fe. You've got middle and upper income families sending their kids to private schools. We've got the highest percentage or proportion of students in private schools, I think, in the whole state, and primarily lower income students in the public schools. So it's not the public schools that have become segregated, it's that there's just lots of folks that don't go to public schools. But it's still an issue that we need to discuss. So the other part of that question is going to be, given the narratives of race, gender, and alienation in our education systems and curricula, how do we create spaces and opportunities for decolonial education and ways of thinking? So we're going to start. No pressure. And then, whoever else wants to respond to the questions.
Those are really huge questions, and so I will do my best to start to address it. When we think about segregation and integration, one of the big things to think about is oftentimes when we hear the narrative of integration, it's usually an individual story of an individual person overcoming like an individual story of bigotry and racism. And those are important stories, right? And we need to have them. But really, when we're talking about what true integration looks like, it's really about how we start to consider things like unequal distribution of power. We have to think about, as we integrate our cities and bring our different communities together, how we also decenter dominant culture. Because a lot of times when we say, oh, but we have included, the Mexican kids from the South Side, or oh, we have Pueblo kids at our schools, we haven't really thought about how we have integrated culture, thought, and values from all of those different perspectives. And really, at the heart of it, if we're really thinking about integration, we really have to think about the original conditions of oppression that have never been addressed. And so that's really, we have to think about systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic, heterosexism, and how those are all embedded into the fibers of our school. And so, of course, we want to make sure that we create opportunities for people to have, to able to address those individual, acts of malice against each other. But if we only ever stay in that conversation, we really never see the forest for the trees. We never are able to see how that systemic racism, sexism, heterosexism keeps us apart.
I would like to talk about the different schools in which we really teach. We are a city where people really don't mix. Cities where you have the different communities that do not interact with each other. For example, our students in the South Side, they don't go to the plaza or the museum. Even when it's free, it's not part of their culture that parents will take them to these areas. We need to do it if we get the buses and if the teachers are interested in doing a field trip to go and see what's in the plaza, for example. So there are different, kids are having completely different experience, and parties where they live and what is their family custom to do, and this is very sad because it really impacts their growing and their experience of where they are. I want to talk about an experience I had last year. I decided to work with my students in I'm an immigrant too. And I decided to work with my students about the sense of identity, who they are. And without a doubt, there are a mix of cultures and experience. Some of them had been born here, but their experience is two cultures. They live between two cultures. And I think we as educators need to do more to provide this space to think about their identity and how can they integrate themselves, but first understand who they are and value and honor both of these experiences. And we should do much more in social studies in our school because this is a very important subject to have.
I like to talk about curriculum because that is such a huge problem in all of our schools. And getting our teachers, our instructors, to talk about diverse cultures, to change the conversation and the actual academics around history and tell the stories of the indigenous people, of the Spanish. I mean, we're talking about New Mexico. We have the Secretary of the Public Education Department talking about manifest destiny, how, you know, we're the white people, the Europeans came across to take the lands, and that was our job to do that and to settle and displace everyone else. And we're not talking about that in our curriculum, and quite honestly, it is often a battle with instructors to get that integration of ideas and conversations, and part of the reason is because we as white people are so threatened that talking about the past, it's somehow our fault. Well, it's only our fault if we don't do anything to change it today. And that's what we need to do in our curriculum.
I'd just like to speak on the question about how do we create these comfortable places for education to take place outside of, or rather integrating in the very real societal pressures of sexism, racism, all of that. And so the very first day in the history class that I ended up taking instead of the AP one, my teacher had us write our name on a piece of paper, and then in each corner he wanted us to write down 4 things about ourselves. What do you do when you're sad? What do you do when you're happy? What's one thing you do for fun, and what pisses you off? And he took that information about us and he designed the curriculum for the rest of the year based off of what made us angry, what was it that we were passionate about. So we had project-based assignments where we had to create a mural regarding things that were very dear to us. I ended up making a stencil for education. It was a girl in a cap and gown. But so I think the answer to kind of opening up the space to a more inclusive learning environment and to make sure that it is something that everyone can benefit from is work with the students, not with the system.
Thank you. And I might add a couple of comments on that one. My work is primarily with families and young people outside of the school systems. I've been in school systems. I've worked for both Santa Fe Public Schools. Oh, and I did want to mention, Dr. Garcia was invited, and she really wanted to be here, but they have a board meeting tonight, and they couldn't change the board meeting for us, even though I insisted. So she needed to be there. Those are her bosses. But she said, good luck with our conversation here, and she'd like to hear what the results are. So we'll send her a copy of the video for only $14.99. And she orders 2. So I work directly with families and young people. And it's real interesting. Some folks that have arrived recently, some folks that are immigrant but have been here for a while, I work with a lot of Native youth, Chicano youth, and a variety, right? Primarily low-income families, though. And it's interesting how people perceive barriers and boundaries. I'm from Chicago, the original capital of barriers and boundaries, right? The original most segregated, city in the United States. And when we were growing up, we were told explicitly, this is where the Mexicans start, right? Or where we end, you can't go beyond that because that's the Italian neighborhood or that's the Greek neighborhood, and something bad will happen to you if you go in that direction. And we sometimes explored, but oftentimes we just sort of kept our boundaries. Here in Santa Fe, it's been interesting. I've been here 10 years. I spent a bunch of years in Albuquerque. I've been here 10 years. And there's been sort of an ebb and flow. You mentioned the plaza, which is in many ways the center of the city, right? Politically, culturally, business, et cetera, sort of centers around the idea of the plaza, not necessarily the space, the physical space, but the idea of the plaza. During the summer, you have parties, you have music, you have all kinds of things, and for the most part, you don't see a huge, I was going to say military, police presence on the plaza. It's interesting when it's lowrider, when they have the car shows, then all of a sudden there's like 4 police officers per corner, right? And people see these things. People feel the boundaries going up, right? People get the message, this is really your space, so while you're here, we're going to watch you. Things to keep in mind. Next question, and this time we'll ask for a volunteer. I won't ask Patricia to start. What can local arts and cultural organizations do to promote educational equity and access in Santa Fe? And I'm also including what is the best way to engage community members in the process of creating more equitable educational climate in Santa Fe? Anybody want to kick it off?
I'll volunteer. So I'll base this in a memory that I was sharing with Tomas and Esteban as we were planning for this panel is, so part of being a child who was raised by 2 teachers who worked in Santa Fe is a lot of times our holidays were impacted by that because they needed to be present at things like Halloween carnivals and other kinds of events, and so we would come along with them. But in terms of how community schools, right? Schools that are in people's barrios and we have a connection to, like with what Miguel Angel is talking about with how families get involved, how communities get involved. One of the things I remember about growing up is, unlike thinking of the plaza as the center, Laragoite Elementary was really one of my centers in growing up because we would always celebrate the posadas at Laragoite. And I know that there's issues with separation of church and state. This was something that would happen after hours. It would be organized by the teachers and by families in that area. And I remember people would bring burros and other, animals that they had, and it would be a reenactment. But then in the gym afterwards, it would be a celebration, with hot cocoa, Frito pies. And in terms of thinking about like my own cultural connectivity, one of the great memories I have about it is that it was the first place I ever got to bust a piñata. I had never done that before. And so in terms a lot of how I was rooted, it had to do with this really beautiful community of schools. And so when we think about contemporary arts organizations, it's really how do those arts organizations, kind of work on that mind, body, spirit split, right? Because at their best, educational spaces are really thinking about how we not just have a life of the mind, but that how our hearts and our spirits are also connected to that work. I am really also a great proponent of place-based education, of knowing where you live and where you work and where your schools are. And if you're new families to the area, getting to know the place that you've moved to. I also am on the board of the Northern Rio Grande National Heritage Area. And our motto for the heritage area is con respeto y permiso. So with respect and permission, we do the work. And a lot of times I think that we can forget that when we're moving into places is we kind of come in with our positionality, with our ideas, with what's important to us. And it's really important to build relationships and to get to know your community.
organizations that do partner with the schools in providing art experience to the students. I am a very strong believer that art education should be integrated into every subject, not just to be one or twice a week experience to the students. I wish the parents also have the opportunity to experience art because for all the reasons in which art is therapeutic and a way of expression, and I would love to see more community art in our city. It will be fantastic to see endeavors in which communities do some sort of art displays together. And it is interesting that in the city where we are, with so many wonderful artists, we do not have so much cooperation in this area. There should be much more work with the communities.
Just speaking in the art community, getting more involved, I'd like to pose a question for Santa Fe, just as an Espanolan. Where are all the murals? Like, I have friends that are from different states that come here and they see all of the murals in Santa Fe and they're like, oh wow, these are everywhere. I'm like, really? Because I think there could be more. One very big part of my experience in elementary school, I went to elementary school in Espanola and then middle and high school in Santa Fe. But in elementary school, every single year we made another different type of mural with our class. And so by the end, there was like 7 different murals around the school that I could point to and say, I was here, I was a part of that. And so I feel like art is a very good way to not only connect the community to schools, but also to give the schools a sense of community.
If I could piggyback off of one of those ideas, if anybody's driven through the Espanola Valley recently, you'll notice that we've had a resurgence of mural work going up through our community. And one of the things in regards to talking about displacement and gentrification is also like the ideologies behind art, right? Murals, by and large, are community driven. It's not usually a single artist, it's artists coming together to do that work. And so in Espanola, there's been a real effort, to bring seasoned artists together with students, elementary, middle school, high school age students, to create that artwork together. And so it's a really powerful movement that's occurring right now. But the other piece is that there's some difficulty sometimes in northern New Mexico, you'll introduce yourself and you say what you do professionally, and then it's like, oh, and I make retablos, oh, and I paint, oh, and I am a fiber artist. And there's this sense that everybody's an artist in northern New Mexico, but because we don't live in the reified market of Santa Fe, right, or that has been created in a place like Santa Fe as an art mecca, right, even thinking how problematic those words are, is that we live art in a really different way in Espanola. It's like almost just a part of our everyday being, and I say this gently because I also know I'm a visitor and a guest in this community, but that there's not as much of a pretension there, right? People make art because it's a part of who we are, it's what we do, we're artists, but there is not that whole level of like the social capital that is necessarily associated with it. So I also see artists really struggling with that, right? People wanting to break into places like art galleries in Santa Fe, but not knowing how to make that connection. And so there is a big disparity in terms of the gentrification of the art world, even between our communities.
Thank you. And before we go on, I want to mention one thing, because the other part of the question was how do we engage more people, more community in creating a more equitable educational environment. Which is a lot of the work that I'm connected to, and there's lots of frustrations, oftentimes on the part of community activists, families, folks with good ideas, looking for a place, for a way to enter the conversation, and there isn't a place to enter. I know there's a couple of folks, for example, right now that are working on a math tutoring project, and they're very frustrated with trying to figure out how do you change the narrative around math education in the public schools. There's folks, myself included, that have been engaged in trying to build more family school partnerships. Again, there's a lot of not barriers that are put up. There's just not a lot of capacity for people to have those kinds of conversations. So things to keep in mind. We're almost at the end of this section. So what we're going to do, I'm consolidating here several questions plus one. It actually fits very well. So here's the question. This is going to be for all four, sort of as we finish this part of the conversation. So I'm posing a scenario for you. Imagine, if you will, a community that's just elected a very progressive, forward-thinking mayor. And they've just tapped you to be the education czar for the community, taking into consideration schools and all the other assets, and you're actually asked to look at the community from an assets-based perspective, not a deficit-based perspective. What would be the first three things that you would propose to your mayor? And this time we'll start on this other end. We'll give Patricia time to think about it.
Three things. I think that from my community college perspective, we're still often thought of as this college out, even though we're in a huge area of residential development now, but we're still kind of out there south of town. I would propose working with the community college and bringing, as we've done here with the Higher Ed Center, but bringing more of our education into places within town. I mean, we do some classes, or we used to. We would come and do them at state offices and things like that. So really integrate our college into the fabric of the community by moving places. I think that would help. I would look too at the public schools for opening themselves up, and this is always a problem with liability issues, but opening their doors to more educational activities. One thing, if we're talking about city government, that is so important to me as someone who works in the bowels of government decision-making, is that we need to have our young people and everyone else understand the processes of city council, county commission, school boards. The school board meeting tonight. How many people go to school board meetings? Yeah, or even watch it on TV, or listen to the city council on our radio. So we've got to do more education about civic participation, not just about voting, which is hard enough to get people to do, but how we can open up our government entities more to bring people in to understand how the process works.
The first thing I will love to advise is to provide more opportunities for youth. And I'm talking more in the teenagers' years. This is a city that is pretty much dead in terms of opportunities for engagement. And that is very sad. That will be a first area I think is a big area of working. Also allow for the real work experience. Bringing, for example, role models of people doing different activities, different professions, different trades into the schools and talk about what it is, and so the kids could have an experience of a real life profession, for example, that probably they don't have in their own environment. And I would love to see, and this happened in other parts of the world, in particular in Brazil, there was an experience of participatory budget planning with the community. And I think, of course, you need to have very educated citizens in order to do this kind of process. But I think it will be fantastic to see an opening of the city government to this kind of participatory experience.
Let's see, so 3 things. Number 1, garden programs in every school with a fully paid teacher that is able to be there all week and is able to see their students once a week. It should be an extra, just like library or computer or art. I've seen the impact that gardens can make. It means higher test scores on science tests. It means kids are more likely to try yet different foods, especially kids from low-income areas whose parents might not be able to afford to buy broccoli and make them eat it all the time, and so they stick with something that's cheaper and they know that their child will eat. So when a kid puts a seed in the ground, they're gonna want to eat what it turns into. Like, it's simple. Another thing I would like to see is more programs like what El Camino has for language diversity. I've seen very briefly their classrooms transferring it from English to Spanish, and it's just wonderful to see all of the students completely engaged and able to keep up. I do have Spanish-speaking students that I'm not able to connect with because they haven't been given as much English in their regular school day. And so it's a lot harder for me to communicate. And lastly, I would like to see more project-based learning.
So 3 things that we would tell the politician who has the magic wand. Okay. 1, I would say stop selling out our schools, right? Stop the corporatization of our schools, get Pearson out, get testing out, and start trusting teachers again. When we think about curriculum, it's not about, we should have standards, right? There should be this, set of skills that students leave their education experience with, but we shouldn't standardize teachers, right? One of the beautiful things about educators, and I grew up with an amazingly creative family. So my dad was known at Gonzales Elementary for being the teacher who would teach his students mathematics by teaching them woodworking. And so through measuring and creating different kinds of woodworking projects that were often very much in alignment with, the traditional art forms of northern New Mexico, he was teaching his kids, different kinds of geometry, of fractions. And so he really embedded it in that experience-based learning. He was also a very active person. He was like the consummate jock. I always say he was the Chicano Al Bundy. And so he would teach his history, right? History of the world through different ball games. And so it's like that sense of how you get students involved, active, and engaged. The other thing, and I'm gonna give a shout out to my colleague, Toby Bott-Lyons, is how do we rethink how we engage students, right? A lot of times, especially at community colleges, institutions of higher ed, we always hear about how students aren't college ready. Students aren't ready, for the rigors of the college classroom. They're not prepared. And Toby has done a great lit review for a project that we're working on campus where we reframe that, where we flip the switch on it, and it's how do we become student-ready schools, right? And so one of the big issues that we deal with a lot are issues of precarity. So food scarcity, housing, issues. We have students who are homeless who live in their cars. How do we address that on our campus? Right now, we don't have residences on our campus, but we should have offices where social workers can be present. One of the biggest reasons that a lot of our young men, and I think that we need to call ourselves out for not having a young man of color on this panel, right? Because right now, young men of color are the most at-risk population in higher ed. For us, a lot of times it's because young men are on probation for silly charges, right, that they made a mistake about, but they go from like monthly UIs to weekly UIs to daily UIs, and they're in Espanola, and their parole officer is in Santa Fe, and so it literally becomes a barrier to them being present in class. Why can't we have parole officers on campus, right? So really thinking about who our student communities are and how we start connecting the dots between those different silos in our communities. We tend to think of, oh, criminal justice is here, education is here, social services is here, when in fact it's that same idea of intersectionality, is that we're complex human beings, and what can we do to take away some of those obstacles and put the services in the same places?
Thank you for your conversations and your small groups. We're going to have final concluding thoughts from our panelists, and we're going to start here with Maestra.
So first of all, I think these kind of conversations are incredibly important to build a momentum and also to build the support of the different sectors and into what's next, which I think is the key. Just not have the conversation, but go into actions and proposals of what can we do from here. And making the link about economic development in this city and education, because it's unbelievable the amount of resources that we are training and they go away of this state, and they will not be, we're not going to be in a strong state if we don't keep our kids here, our graduates here. And I think this needs to be a focus of a strong effort to link the needs and the training and the needs and the future needs of this community.
Well, thank you all for being here. This is very helpful what Chainbreakers is doing to try to bring together people for dialogue. About 20 years ago, a book was written called Bowling Alone. And it was, and the premise of the book was that we stopped engaging in our civic areas, and we stopped going to PTA meetings, and we stopped talking to our neighbors because we were too busy sitting at home alone watching television. And of course, that's just sort of a brief synopsis of it. But certainly today, with all of our social media, we're not necessarily talking face to face with each other anymore. And to me, that is so important if we're going to change, because we're the only ones who can change whatever we don't like. And we can do it as individuals on a day-to-day basis where we personally challenge injustice and we speak up about it wherever we are. But we do have to come together as a powerful group. I've been very inspired by the women's marches that we've had over the last 2 years, where people who weren't engaged at all, women mostly, who weren't engaged at all, suddenly coming out and going, okay, now what can I do, because this is so bad. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you talking about these issues. Thank you.
All right, so just some closing statements. I would really like to, or I guess my closing statements are just kind of things that I would like to see in the schools. I would like to see better incentives for substitutes. They're people that students can form a life or a school career-long connection with. I had a substitute that I knew from middle school all the way to my senior year, and she did make an impact in my life. So I really feel like we need to treat our substitutes better. Really listen to the students, and when we have a program trying to integrate into a school, please give it the support that it needs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Eco High School, but it did start out as a project-based learning curriculum within Santa Fe High. It wasn't a separate thing, and we never wanted to be separated from the rest of Santa Fe High. That was them taking the bad kids that wanted to do project-based learning and kicking them into their own school. And I'd just like to see us stop telling our smart kids that they can get out. We shouldn't look at it as an opportunity to escape. We should be creating reasons for people to stay in Santa Fe.
Yeah, I really want to just echo what my sister Ruby here just said. In preparing for this, I was just doing some journaling, and I was remembering it was probably 2nd or 3rd grade when one of my teachers said, "You're smart, you're going to get to go someplace else." And so part of my goal in being an educator and starting my career in New Mexico, Northern was always my goal. As I was going through my master's and PhD program, I would always get the messages like, you need to go work at an R1, you need to go work at a private, right? And my goal was always Northern New Mexico College because, I get these really contradictory messages being a scholar in Northern New Mexico. On the one hand, and it's really problematic, people will say, "You're too good for that place." And my response to that is always, no, actually, I wish I could be better, right? And I wish that there was more of me, and I wish that there was company, and I wish that my best friends who live all over the country felt like they could live and work here in their home community and see that they could have families and have a future and be a part of Northern New Mexico. And on the other side of it is, because I chose Northern, there's this sense of erasure from the greater academy, right? That somehow we're not a part of the discourse. So what I would like us to leave with tonight is thinking about what are the connections between the urban and the rural educational systems, understanding that rural communities need to have centers of education, so public schools K through 12 that are strong, but also institutions of higher ed that are our own. Because the knowledge that come from our communities, right, the deep wells of indigenous knowledge, of elder knowledge, of traditional knowledge, in addition to academic knowledge, are unique, and we offer important perspectives that have already changed the world and will continue to change the world.